Southern Rail Fan is the place for amazing videos of all types of trains. Southern Rail Fan, subscribe today.
In the early 1990s, the vision of an approaching train began to change. North American railroads were starting to use auxiliary lights on their locomotives in addition to the headlight. These lights became known as ditch lights. Ditch lights have been used on Canadian railroads for years. They were used to shine light into the ditch along the railroad's curves. U.S. railroads started using auxiliary lights for grade crossing safety, but the name ditch lights stuck. The birth of true ditch lights began on Pacific Great Eastern Railroad in Canada in the early 1950s. These extra lights were needed to see possible rock slides. After a couple derailments due to unseen slides, the extra lights began being used on all locomotives of BC Rail, Canadian National, and Canadian Pacific. This is how the Canadian ditch lights work. U.S. railroad ditch lights are mounted on the front of the locomotive and shine directly out towards the front of the locomotive. Canadian ditch lights are mounted at angles. The right-hand side light is mounted at a slight angle to cast light to the left-hand side. The left-hand side light is mounted at an angle to cast light to the right side. What this does is gives the crew lighting in the ditch line either on a left-hand side curve or a right-hand side curve. They would be able to see a rock slide in that inside curve. Looking closely at this BC rail unit, you can see how the ditch lights are mounted at slight angles to each other. FRA began to adopt auxiliary lighting rules in June of 1995, placing them into writing in March of 1996. The rules include the auxiliary lights must be white, must be placed on the front of the locomotive, be at least 200,000 candela, and be 36 inches above the top of the rail, and must be activated anytime the locomotive is in motion. To run a locomotive with no auxiliary lights, the railroad must have no grade crossings or run at speeds of less than 20 miles per hour. Antique equipment and museum pieces had slightly different rules depending on the manufacture date of the equipment. There were two major variations in the use of auxiliary lights. Number one was mounting location. Above the anti-climber, below the anti-climber, or mounted directly on the anti-climber. In these next two videos, see if you can spot the second variation. first train had a Union Pacific lead locomotive with steady burn auxiliary lights. The second train had a Norfolk Southern lead locomotive with alternating auxiliary lights. Alternating or steady burn is the second variation. Western Roads, BNSF, and Union Pacific use steady burn auxiliary lights with few exceptions. Eastern Roads, Norfolk Southern, and CSX use alternating auxiliary lights with few exceptions. Units with alternating auxiliary lights have them activated by the horn. In this next video, we see a CSX train taking the siding in a meet. The crew has turned off the auxiliary lights and dimmed the headlight, but the auxiliary lights still flash when the horn is activated. Auxiliary lights come in a variety of housings. Bulbs are most commonly par 56 halogen bulbs. Bulb mounts are made of non-corrosive cast metal with brass fittings. Each light in the mount is about 8 to 10 inches wide. Companies such as Power Rail produce LED bulbs, but they're not yet in common use. I hope you've enjoyed this brief look at locomotive auxiliary lights, also known as ditch lights. Thank you for watching.